go back into rhythm science. My book is called Rhythm Science, and it's precisely because it's about a certain linkage between mythology and technology. And the reason I started off my discussion with underground versus overground aesthetics is because essentially this is what's been used to kind of keep out underground, whatever you want to call it, pop culture, mass culture issues. So, for example, Warhol in the 50s took years to actually convince the conventional art world that the idea of the copy was a very specific act. And in fact, he had kind of a weird relationship with Duchamp because of the whole necessary relationship to the found object. It took Duchamp almost 10 years to sort of acknowledge Warhol, for example. But the funny thing is, it doesn't matter. These are artists who are viewed in a museum in a Eurocentric context. For me as an African American, dealing with a downtown and multicultural environment of very specifically multicultural contemporary art, the art world's pretty much like South Africa, apartheid. It's very extremely white bread. So what I'm doing right now is trying to figure out some strategies about multiculturalism and multiple perspectives on contemporary art that include some overground elements and some underground elements. So let me just get this started. Rhythm science. What you're seeing here is the cover of Scientific American from 1914. And it's a photograph by Eddie and Jules Moret, who was using machinery relatively similar to Edison and to Méliès. These kinds of still motion cameras allowed him to break apart the motion of anything the camera would view. So you can essentially think of this as a visual sampler. And when I sample a track or a beat from a song, what I'm doing is breaking that apart as well in the same way. So say, for example, a sequence of movement would be broken into all these kind of movements here. But the funny thing is, if you pull them out of context, you can easily reconfigure, like what Méliès was doing with his own head, the sequence of the motions. So each of these is a discrete moment. And what Méliès called actualités were these kinds of scene moments. But with Griffith, later on, he was able to create literally an entire mythology. The film Birth of a Nation was used as a Ku Klux Klan recruitment device, actually. And they played at Klan recruitment rallies and burned crosses. So, from Scientific American to the Ku Klux Klan. To make a long story short, what we're seeing here is the science of the sequence and pulling together elements to create an entire environment. Now, I'm going to shift from there to this idea of database aesthetics. Because whenever you make a film or make a track, at this point you're dealing with density of information. Behind me, for example, if you look at a gigabyte, which is about, a short scale billion decimal equivalent, you can see it's basically 10 to the 9th power. A megabyte is 10 to the 6th power. Sorry about the resolution. It's a little, can everybody see the numbers here? Yeah. But what we're looking at, say for example, your average iPod these days has a 20 gigabyte memory. To make a film or to play a DVD, DVD is usually between 5 and 7 gigabytes. To render a DVD file after you've made a film, for example, because of the sheer volume of numbers the computer has to crunch, it sometimes takes even a week. I remember it took The Matrix, almost every scene they rendered, remember the bullets flying or the guys flying in the air, those had to be rendered individually because of the sheer volume of what they call vector maps. And again, the layers of animation that were going on took up so much memory that they had to figure out ways to kind of compress them. So what we're looking at is database aesthetics as playing with compression, thinking about how to fit as much information into as small a space as possible. So to me, the idea here is looking at art of large numbers now on the verge of the invisible, and thinking about how to relate that to urban youth culture. And that's why I was playing you the Marcel Duchamp quote where he says, art is now based on pure intuition. But this is kind of an intuitive mathematics. For example, you don't need to be a physicist to know gigabyte versus megabyte if you're buying an iPod, for example. You probably want a lot of gigabytes, right? But the funny thing is your average person doesn't necessarily engage how these kinds of functions of memory operate. They're just looking at it as a consumer. So for me as an artist, when I kind of go and dig into these kind of issues, I'm always having to deal with memory. And the pun, of course, is that, say for example, the reason I gave you guys all those different mixed CDs is that everyone is going to leave here with a different memory. But, of course, you have to listen to it and activate it. So let me play you a bootleg example of some of the stuff I'm talking about. And the funny thing is that these are all clips that I use for my lectures, but for my concerts I have different stuff. So. again, the sense of humor that kind of fun, it's humorously engaging here is kind of getting people to think about what happens when you have a different context in place. And the funny thing about DJing is that you're always moving between contexts. And because of that, whenever I'm dealing with some of my art world projects or when I'm doing my club stuff, or for that matter, during a lecture here, I'm trying to navigate several environments simultaneously. And the issue is, how do we think about this as theater? A couple of weeks ago, I presented my film Birth of a Nation at the base of the Acropolis, and they gave me the Herod Atticus Theater. And about 4,000 people came out to the show. Those are the ruins of the theater, and I set up this projection screens. And the idea here is to think about, like I was saying earlier, theater of the rhyme. But it's not necessarily about the grammar of a voice, but the grammar of the information being projected, or for that matter, being composed. So we're looking at database aesthetics as a collision between ancient and modern. Like I said before, the idea here is, for example, the phrase that I always kind of riff on with this is William Gibson's phrase where he says, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." So thinking about different notions of time, different notions of theater, and how people respond to the environments, you have to remember, before a couple thousand years ago, people sitting in this, the actor would have to project their voice, for example. They'd have to actually very specifically even speak to different directions of the audience to make sure people could hear it. Well, I bought in a couple megawatt speakers, and behind each of these screens you can see the speakers are almost as big as these arches. Those are big bass woofers. So, it was kind of a hip-hop Acropolis. But the idea here is thinking about contemporary art as a collision, and that's what I'm kind of riffing on. And this is, again, to give you a little bit of scale, right? All right. John Cage. The reason I keep this, here you go. Right. John Cage was one of the first composers to kind of think of how to create music with turntables. And in 1939, he did a piece called Imaginary Landscape, where essentially you walked into a concert hall and there was a whole bunch of turntables playing at different frequencies. People got pissed off. They were like, what is going on? We paid money to come see a concert. Then the turntables would just play frequencies. And the name of the composition was Imaginary Landscape. And the funny thing is, when you think about frequencies in this era, and the reason I kind of riff on this is because frequencies are the things that hold our networks together at this point. You can look at the wireless networks, the restaurants, for example. You can look at the satellite frequencies. All of those were, in a certain sense, pre-thought out, in a way, by the artist. So the artist's imagination versus the technological environment we're living in. So multiple record players creating an environment of frequencies. Now, for us, it's the satellite networks and that kind of thing.